Talking today, there's me and my colleague Elaine, who has lots and lots of experience as a teacher and head of department and director of education and all kinds of things. We've also both been language assistants ourselves. So I was in France, Elaine was in Germany. So we've been there, and we have also worked with foreign language assistants and specialist TAs. So we have experience on both sides. And today, as I said, we'll be looking at how you can get the most out of foreign language assistants or specialist teaching assistants if you have one, and if you don't have one, how could you make the case for one? So the things we'll be covering are A, targeting the assistant's expertise where it's most needed, so looking at where you can really, where they can make the most difference to your teaching. Different ways of working with the assistant, so lots of these you might be doing already, but other things that you might not have considered potentially. How you can adapt to remote or blended learning. So obviously we know at the moment that lots of foreign language assistants are stuck, well, they're having to teach from their own countries and doing that remotely. So that's a completely new way of doing things. How can we deal with that? How can we adapt to that? How can you support a foreign language assistant when you do get one that's come to stay in your host school? And how can you sort of look after their well-being? And finally, if you don't have a foreign language assistant or a specialist TA and you'd like to make the case for one, or perhaps you do have one but budgets are being cut and that's one area that potentially your school might be looking at cutting, how you can make the case for that. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague Elaine, who's going to be talking about targeting this assistance expertise where it's most needed.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you've put your details into the chat and introduced yourselves to us. As Zoe said, I'm Elaine. I have worked many years with foreign language assistants in many different ways, and more recently working with the Multi-Academy Trust that I was working with until Christmas. We had 14 assistants who I sort of looked after for the first term and worked together with them, supporting them in their journey of settling into working with us in England. Obviously, looking at your teaching assistants and your specialist teaching assistants, if you are lucky to have one of those, some of them will have different expertise. Some of them will be full-time or part-time, and some of them may well be native and non-native speakers. So obviously it's important to understand how you can get the most out of those people that you're working with. It's crucial to know how you can put them into your timetable, and so if they are full-time or part-time, that's an important aspect to think about. Being an assistant in a school is a two-way process because they bring a lot to you, but also you tend to give back to them quite a lot of things. So I think over the course of this session, over this next 50 minutes or so, 45 minutes, it's important to bear that in mind, that it is very much a two-way process. Listening and speaking is obviously the areas in which you will find the assistant the most valuable. They can speak the language, they can speak it very well, and they can speak it fluently. They can slow down, they can support your students if they are feeling extremely uncomfortable speaking a language, particularly during lockdown. As Zoe mentioned earlier, you know, some of the assistants are working from home still in their own countries, and therefore it's a golden opportunity to get them involved in your classroom, to be able to work with students on a one-to-one basis using breakout rooms and various things which we'll mention a little bit later on. One of the things I've done a lot of the time with my assistants has been to use them for listening, but obviously if you are asking them to create resources to turn a reading assessment or a reading text into a listening text, and to get them to set some questions for that. That will give you more access to more listening materials, because as we know, listening is very much a difficult skill for students, because at the moment they're only allowed to listen to it a couple of times. Wherever you are in the world, most of the exams just give them that twice through. And so if you can get them to be involved in that, supporting you with making resources from reading activities, that is another thing that you could harness their expertise at. I think as well that in my time as a teacher, I've taught many disaffected students. The minute that they see somebody who comes from a different language, who is much more nearer to their age than you are, if you are a teacher who's been in the profession for a while, you will see that the children will become so enthused at listening to someone who speaks the language that they're learning, but who's actually younger than yourself, or at least nearer to them in age. And it's also really interesting to think about students who you teach who don't have the opportunity to get out of the town that they live in, or even to use the even go on holiday somewhere abroad, let alone just to the seaside in our country or wherever you are in the world. So having someone who comes from that country and actually where the language is spoken, regardless of where that country is, and have them in your classroom with you, or having them just you could even get them to go on duty with you, as I've done on a few occasions, that the students actually understand that even the most disaffected ones can become much more motivated to learn if they see that someone out there other than you is speaking the language. As I said earlier, it does help to nurture the confidence of students who are not very confident in learning the languages if they get the opportunity to have that little one-to-one experience with them. And often the assistant will be the one who they'll kind of see outside in the corridor, or maybe they see them on the way home going on the bus, or various aspects like that, just to actually even speak to them. And sometimes speaking to them in English is a good way to get their confidence going as well, and then they start to sort of become more confident to speak to someone they've never met before in the target language. Obviously, the assistant will allow you to raise the cultural aspirations in your school and support cultural activities. Those of you that are familiar with the Mandarin Excellence Programme has been it's a link to the Chinese and the English embassy, whereby Chinese assistants are brought over to this country to support work in primary and secondary, and they obviously work alongside teachers supporting the cultural things. Some schools have set up Chinese restaurants, they've set up a Chinese market, they've done all kind of things there. But certainly your assistant is definitely the one with the expertise in the culture, and allowing your school to to tap into that. The links and the projects that they could bring with them. All of your assistants or specialist teaching assistants will have been a pupil themselves in a school, whether that be in their own country or a country where the language is spoken. For example, if they've come over to you via another country, you could get them to contact their old school and send letters to them, whether that be via proper letters or postcards, or whether that even be virtual letters, as a lot of projects have started to spring up after the lockdown, where you can apply to the British Council and you can have a link with any classroom in a school in any country where the language that you're teaching in your school is spoken. I remember going back many years of really interesting times when we've had a shoebox or a little parcel arrive from a school, particularly in Germany or France or somewhere, and they've opened it up and there's been lots of pictures and lots of letters and lots of little things, just tiny little presents. The students in the class have always been extremely grateful to receive these, but their eyes have lit up and they've gone, oh my goodness, somebody actually speaks this language and is taking the time to send us some letters and things. So getting something like that, if you've got that opportunity to do that with a link from a school or from a town even where your assistant comes from, is something to tap into their expertise over. Obviously, the target language is used in many classrooms to the extent that you're able to use it, because it's sometimes quite difficult if you work in a school where it's difficult to have children in there. There might be a few behaviour issues. Sometimes it's difficult to speak to them in the target language if you want to make the teaching as successful as possible. But certainly, if you can get your assistant to just go up to them in the lesson and just ask them how they're getting on, or just speak to them and practice a few very basic questions with your students, or even on the corridor, just give them that remit when they're out and about, just to say, bonjour, ça va, or hallo, guten Tag in German, wie geht's, and all of that, and the Spanish equivalent as well, ¿qué tal? Because English and Scottish curriculums have such a focus on areas in the speaking which is spontaneous at this moment in time, so they do add that era, that sort of era of spontaneity to the classroom. We've talked about creating some resources. I know that when Zoe and I were preparing this session, we both talked about how often we'd had the native speaker to actually make audios for us, because they are so useful to have extra resources. Like I said earlier, about creating a reading resource into a listening resource, but just talking about themselves, talking about their town, talking about their experiences in whatever area you need them to speak in. Link it to the GCSE or to your textbook, or just to any random topic that your students might find interesting. Another thing that I've done with the teaching assistants is I've got them to support feeder schools and transition. For example, you could give them a small group of students in year 7 in English schools, or in S1 in Scotland, for example, or in whatever equivalent year is your first year in secondary, and get them to do a little presentation, or get them to work with a foreign language assistant to go back to the feeder school where they came from, or maybe to one of your most important feeder schools, or even a feeder school where you know that you are struggling to recruit students from, but you feel that you could get some students to come to your school from there if you had some positive PR experience. And sending an assistant with students from your school who are ambassadors for languages is a really good way of aiding that sort of transition for those students who, first of all, will come and will recognise some students when they see them in year 8 or in S2, and even just a good PR stunt for your school. Obviously, they are playing a big part in supporting the MFL uptake, which is the English government's aspiration to do that in the next few years. They're hoping to get up to 90% of the students doing a GCSE in England as part of the EBAC. So having an assistant who speaks the language there and who actually can just be an ambassador for that language and support you with the MFL uptake. It's very good CPD for your staff on many levels. You may have some staff who speak exceptionally well, an exceptionally good level of language, but it's never not good, should I say. It's never a bad opportunity to have them to have some spoken language with someone from the country. So it's a great idea to just chat to them at break time or lunchtime, or even socially, just to talk to them in your language to keep your language skills up. If you have support in less proficient staff, so in your school you might have, as Zoe said earlier, some staff who don't speak the language very well, or who only have a GCSE in it themselves or an A-level, and they need to have good experience to upskill their own language skills. And again, it just gives them that opportunity to have some time to speak to the assistant. Even part of the assistant's time could be put aside for that, so an hour a week or half an hour a week just to spend with some of your staff as part of their timetable. One big thing that I certainly have always found with assistants is that they are so up to date with everything. I can always relate back, as Zoe said, to my time in Germany, and I know she can to her time in France, when you often think time stood still in those times. Well, now, sort of years later, my experiences are still there, as are Zoe's, but what's current in TV, in the vocabulary for technology and social media, your assistants can be invaluable in giving your students the most up-to-date vocabulary. And this relates well with your students as well, because they know that it's happening at that time in that country, whose language they're learning. It's always a good idea to get your assistants, every time they pop home, to come back and bring as much real, authentic material with them as they can, which you can use in the classroom. And obviously, in the later stages of last year, when they said about the teacher endorsements for England being something that you're going to have to submit for your year 11 students, if you can support your FLAs and your teaching assistants to understand how to award those judgments, they can be an invaluable support there with that. Okay, I'm going to hand back over to Zoe now to do the second section.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about different ways of working with the assistants, and some of these are ways that you might have experienced yourself if you've been a foreign language assistant, or that you might currently use, but then hopefully will be some different tips that you can have. I'm going to try and make this as practical as possible. So generally these are divided up into 3 areas. You can work one-to-one, in pairs or small groups, or you could do some kind of team teaching with the assistant in the class. And that's going to partly depend on who the assistant is. So it might be a bit different for a foreign language assistant who is there for a short period of time. You maybe want to intervene with certain areas and who are native speakers. You might have, if you're lucky enough to have a specialist TA who is there with you permanently. Fantastic, great luck. You might want to use them a bit differently. So I'm going to go through them bit by bit. So first of all, one-to-one. You could do targeted interventions. So this might be with people who are at the sort of the 3-4 or the 4-5 borderline, or whatever the equivalent is. So if you have in your school system, because I know we have people from different countries with us today. So yeah, looking at those, how can you work with individuals to get them over the line? And they can really spend some time individually looking at particular areas that they might have. For this, you would need to give the foreign language assistant a little bit of information about what kind of things they need to do, because bear in mind that they will have come from a different school system and they won't necessarily know what it is that you need to do, because obviously different school systems have different focuses. So, you know, in the British system, and depending on the exam board, there's often a real focus on tenses, opinions, connectives, those things. So you know, right, that's what they really need to focus on. You can also, if you've got any gifted and talented students, or any of those students that you really feel aren't quite being stretched, particularly if you've got a mixed ability class, you feel like you really want to let some of those, you know, real high flyers really shine, scheduling some one-to-one time with a language assistant can be really useful for that. And that might be even actually looking at particular structures, grammatical structures that maybe you might not be doing with others, or a bit more vocabulary, for example, or it might be looking at yeah, just like different, looking at coursework, if your system does coursework, things that they might be doing for that, and actually just conversation practice as well, so they get really confident in that. If you have an exam that has a speaking exam, if you have a curriculum that has a speaking exam or speaking coursework, as some exam boards might have in different countries, then this is a really great time to do that. So that's what I used to do a lot with my year 11s when I had a foreign language assistant, is that I would take them one by one. This was back when they were doing coursework, so they could actually practice and memorize different things that they'd written. But even if that's not the case, even if you have a speaking exam, this is really good for practicing spontaneous speech. You can give the foreign language assistant some questions that they can look at, and then get the students to answer them. And depending on how comfortable the foreign language assistant is, or the specialist TA, if you've got one, you might want to get them to either record the student for you to mark it afterwards, or actually potentially they could help you a little bit. So particularly this year, where lots of people in England, for example, are doing a speaking endorsement and you're collecting evidence, but you're not actually having a test or an exam. This is a great way to get students to, you know, to record, so you have that kind of portfolio of evidence, and even if it's just, you know, 5-10 minutes out of each lesson, then you've got that bank of evidence they can have. That can be really useful. If you do want to get the assistant to mark, or at least give some feedback, then you do need to give them very clear guidelines as to what that entails. It is difficult, or it's different for a native speaker, I should say, because they're going to be holding people to slightly different standards and potentially not focusing on the same areas that we might for the exam. So that's really helpful to just give them some real guidelines. And maybe what you could do is, if they could do some recordings and you could look at them together, so you can see what they mean, you know, looking at some kind of mark scheme together, and then they could do it from then on, which obviously saves you some marking, which can be really useful, and also gets the students used to speaking and recording. And this can be done, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but this can be done remotely as well, because if you're doing this at the moment, if your foreign language assistant is still in their home country, you can do a screen recording on Teams or Zoom or whatever, so they can still do those recordings and keep the evidence. That's really useful. So one-to-one, those are different ways that you can do that. The next is looking at pairs and small groups, and this is probably the most classic way to use foreign language assistants. So you could take them out, they could take them out for pairs and small groups and have conversations. And it can be really useful to you to practice different areas that you want to focus on, particularly if you've got any lower attaining or disadvantaged students. This can really just motivate them a little bit more. I think, as Elaine's mentioned, that it's really useful for them to see that there is a person who actually speaks this language. This isn't just some weird thing that you do or that maybe the other teachers do. I know a French teacher who once told me that at the end of a lesson, one of his students said, "You must be very clever to make up a language like this, sir." You know, and because they'd never met anyone who spoke French, and it hadn't really occurred to them that there were real people, that this was a real language of communication. So that can be really, really useful. Think about what you want the foreign language assistant to do with this. So we'll talk a bit more about how you support them later, but make sure this is very, very focused. So which particular skills do you want them to practice? It's probably going to be speaking, but it might have some kind of, there'll probably be a grammatical element to it or vocabulary element as well. You want them to make it fun. But yeah, don't just throw them in the deep end and say, oh, well, take them out and do something on holidays. You know, really think about what it is that they can be doing. Another thing you can do is actually have a carousel with the speaking. This is pairs and small groups, which is partly in the classroom at the same time. So if you are doing a carousel of different activities, either in the room or outside the room, you can have the language assistant as one of those stations in the carousel. So that means that not only can you have, you know, different activities of reading and grammar and vocabulary and so on, writing, but you could actually have either a listening, actually, because they could be playing something or reading something aloud, or they could have a speaking station, which just means that you can really branch out on the skills that you cover. And the last thing for the pairs and small groups is you think about if they would be interested in doing some kind of lunch club, which could be really interesting for students who are really keen, or actually if you, depending on how your school works, there are some systems, I know there are some schools where not all of the students learn every language in year 7, for example. So if it's a case that for example, the last school I taught at, every student did French, and then they were divided in half as to whether they did German or Spanish with that. It would mean that you could actually offer the other language for students that don't normally get to do that, which can really help just to motivate students and increase your MFL uptake. And then the final thing is thinking about team teaching. And this can be really, really powerful, but it also means that you really need to think about what it is you want the foreign language assistant to do and to give them that help. So one thing is they could have a section of your lesson. This could be a cultural thing, so you get them to repair something about, you know, la chandeleur, for example, when it's that time, chandeleur, and or you know, something that's going on in that country, or if it's getting towards Christmas, for example, how do they celebrate it in their country and present something, or it could be something to do with music is a great one. I still somewhere have the CD that the foreign language, the French language assistant gave to me when I was in 6th form studying French myself, and I still listen to, you know, lots of the artists that were on that original mixtape that he gave me. So that can be really, really powerful. Or also phonics as well. So even if you are a specialist, you're teaching a specialist language, you cannot beat a native speaker. And if they can maybe do that section of introducing new vocabulary and looking at particular phonics areas, that can be so powerful. Another thing you could do is within your normal lesson is you could have them going around to be another pair of eyes in the lesson and helping people. But again, that needs to be really directed. So it's not just, well, walk around and see if you need people, if they need help, because don't forget that unless they're a teaching assistant who may have received some training, if they're a foreign language assistant, they probably haven't had any teaching experience before, and it is a skill, and you know that because you've trained. So you really do need to give them an idea of how it is they can help people, what sort of things they need to do, not just giving them the answers, for example, and also they need to know the class quite well. At that point, it's quite a scary thing. You might probably remember from when you trained, you're sort of walking around the classroom and talking to people. And you don't want to waste them just by having them sort of standing there in the corner, or you know, sitting there looking like a lemon. You know, you really need to get them involved in the classroom, so support them in that. And finally, if you've got some kind of if you've got mixability groups who need to have different activities or with different stimuli, for example, with listening. So I had a foundation and a higher students in the same class, for example. You could get them to go from one side of the classroom or even outside the classroom with one group of students to look at, to do a listening with them, which they can even just read aloud, even if you haven't got a stereo outside or a computer system outside. Or if there was different vocabulary they need to look at, they could take the higher students, or different grammatical structures. So you know, I used one because with my higher students I wanted them to look at the pluperfect, but the foundation students didn't need that. So I got the foreign language assistant to take some students to go through and do some simple exercises with that, while I was teaching the foundation students and doing some consolidation of other things. So there are lots and lots of different things that you can have. And if you've got any particular tips and things that you've found useful yourself, please do put them in the chat. But with all of these things that's really important to remember is choose the right style for each class and actually with each lesson. So it might be different, and really think about where you could use this most. So I would imagine with your Key Stage 4 classes or your exam level classes, one-to-one intervention might be the most useful, although not necessary for every lesson. And also thinking about if you're planning something where you're introducing a big new grammatical structure, for example, or something that's very new, it might actually be quite annoying for you to have and disruptive for students to go out and they come back again 5 minutes later and someone else goes out and they've missed the thing that you've just been introducing. So if it is a kind of slightly more teacher-led lesson where you're introducing something, maybe think about having team teaching that lesson. So yeah, it doesn't have to be the same every time. Think about what your students need, think about what that lesson needs as well. But with all of these things, make sure you plan and let the assistant know what is expected. And I know it's hard because we've got so many things to do and you've got so much planning to do, and having this on top of it. But it's really, really useful. Otherwise, it ends up being a waste. And if the assistant gets wasted over a long period of time, that's when your senior leadership might look at whether that budget is really necessary. So really do try to plan and use the assistant as best as you can. And finally, this mostly relates actually to the team teaching. Try not to be threatened by them in the classroom. So they will be younger most likely, and they will be a bit cooler, and the teachers, the students will probably really like them. And also, unless you're a native speaker yourself, no matter how good your French, German, Spanish or whatever is, theirs will be better because they're a native speaker, and that's fine. And it's one where it's difficult because you're used to being the expert in the classroom, and you kind of have to sort of check your ego a little bit and step down and say, well, actually this person is the expert here. That doesn't mean that you don't know anything, but actually sometimes that can be a really useful perspective for the students to see that you also learned this language as well. So it's okay. You might need to talk to them a bit beforehand about what happens if you say something or you teach something which is perhaps not what they would agree with. We know that there is a difference between what is taught, what's on the exam and so on, and what's actually said. I know that, for example, no French person says n'est-ce pas, but it's kind of the sort of thing that we teach. So you might have to have the conversation beforehand, but really try to see this as an opportunity and not to be threatened. And before I pass over to Elaine, I'm just going to say that I've had a question from someone asking about what G and T stands for. That's gifted and talented. So that's a British acronym, but you might have a different one in particular areas. But it just means that you're very, very high attaining students. Okay, so I'm going to pass back over to Elaine to talk about remote and blended learning.
Thank you, Zoe. And as Zoe said, lots of assistants have been used to support isolation. So I think if you're lucky enough to have a specialist teaching assistant or a foreign language one, whether they be in their own country or here, using them as part of your remote and blended learning, certainly for your blended learning, allowing them to have access to some students who maybe are at home self-isolating is a good way to use your assistants, even if they're sat in a classroom at your school. Now that some schools are back, some are not. If you have a bubble closure goes down or something like that, you could even use the assistant to support a certain number of students in that bubble who you feel need certain support with certain things. As Zoe said, you really need to use your assistant wisely and be able to guide where they need to go. So I think when we go back after remote learning, as we've all done in lockdown at some stage over the last sort of 12 months, looking at the positive lessons that have been learnt from this, I've spoken to lots of foreign language assistants in the last sort of few months, and a lot of them have said it's been a very positive experience for them, and the students have said that as well. I think it's been less positive where the foreign language assistant has not been directed and has not been given the sort of support from the class teacher or from the department, and hasn't been really aware of what has to be taught. So it's really important to be consistent and make sure that your teaching assistants are doing what you ask them to do in school when they're in front of students and working with you or with small groups, and the same thing when they're doing that remotely from home. So sharing with them the scheme of learning or the forthcoming lesson plans or the vocabulary, whatever you want them to teach, is absolutely crucial to allow that to be a successful experience. If you have some pupils that need some gaps addressing in their learning, then you can inform your assistant which students need to be worked on. You could look at where, for example, there are certain grammar things which need to be looked at, certain vocabulary, phonics, which we've already mentioned in previous couple of the slides earlier. Anything that you feel your assistant can be a good support for your students is absolutely vital. Remote oral feedback to teachers and students is something, again, where your foreign language assistants could be giving one-to-one feedback, could be supporting them with their pronunciation, could be giving them some feedback if you have set them a piece of writing to do. And one thing, again, which is crucial there, is to ensure that your assistant is well aware of the marking policy for your department or your school, or maybe the AQA or Edexcel, Educas, or whichever exam board you use, that they are familiar with the success criteria, that particular things are marked, are used to mark the students' work. It's a lot more flexible with older students, as Zoe said, with GCSE, and if you have A-level students, during lockdown or during times when your students are working from home, you may find that they have caring responsibilities, or maybe have to look after siblings lower that are younger than them. So sometimes allowing the assistants to work, if they are a foreign language assistant, to work slightly out of the school day, if that's possible, is another flexible option that you have available to you with foreign language assistants. Certainly the ones that are coming to work with you just for the 1 year, that some of them are more happier to do that after school. They can also work with you on role plays. You could set them a role play. They can be the teacher role. You can do the conversation practice with them, whether that be pre-prepared conversation practice with questions that you want to go through with your students, or it could be, as we said earlier, to use spontaneously, which is really good for the photo card practice, which is currently in the exam boards for England. A lot of students have been, a lot of foreign language assistants have been working from home. Certainly one that I spoke to recently, she took her mobile phone out and her iPad and did a tour of her little street, showed all the students that she was working with what the shop fronts looked like. She even took them around the house so she could show them what it was like in her house, because that's very different to a normal house in the country where some students are living. So that kind of thing is so amazingly cultural, that students would learn a lot just from having that little experience there. If you've got the opportunity on Teams or Google Classroom to use breakout rooms, again, you could do team teaching there, and you can have your assistant popping in and out of the breakout rooms, doing virtual carousel type activities, as Zoe mentioned, works really well there. You could have some working on a particular role play, some working on a particular writing exercise, or just reading something. A read aloud text, as is being muted, as could well be coming in the new GCSE in England, and also, you know, a dictation or something like that, which is very easily prepared, and your students can benefit greatly from having a native speaker in working with them on that. Listening practice, again, we've talked about adapting your resources. If you feel you've got a listening that is particularly difficult, but you want to use it with your class, you could actually get your assistant to maybe do it but slow it down. Or you could get your assistant to do it in shorter chunks, which would allow your students which are more needy and don't actually engage with listening very well, they could actually listen to the same text but done in a slightly different, in a slower voice or in a slightly shorter chunks. That works really well. It's great for differentiation. Whilst they are in their own town, living in their own country, or even when they come back, they could write a newsletter or provide articles from their home country for the students to listen to or to read. I know that in the past I've used foreign language assistants and teaching assistants who speak the language to read stories and to actually sit in front of a camera and video themselves reading a story from a book. It's been particularly powerful for primary school students, because they often enjoy listening to a story, and actually having a native speaker do that is amazing. And then also another thing that you could get them to do is to set some weekly quizzes. For example, they could choose a celebrity from their country, and people in the class have got to ask questions to the teacher to try and find out who that celebrity is. Again, it's very cultural and very up to date. Okay, Zoe, I'll hand back to you now to look at the session for supporting the foreign language system.
Great, thanks, Elaine. And actually, just on that last point, I think that there's actually a lot that we can take from this current situation of remote learning or blended learning and actually take that forward, because some of these things, I think people have had to be very creative, and I've seen people say in the chat that they've used breakout rooms, really well, and there are these different aspects of, recording videos and so on that are so useful. And actually, that doesn't have to stop once everybody goes back into live teaching. So think about what you could use from that in future. The next thing I'm going to talk about then is about supporting foreign language assistants. So this really does just refer to foreign language assistants who are visiting rather than TAs, and also this is about when they are able to come in and stay in the country and teach in your school. So a few things to bear in mind, because they're really important. As Elaine mentioned before, this is a two-way process. It's not just about us getting things from the foreign language assistant, it's also about providing them with a good experience and giving something back as well. So lots of things to focus on. The welfare and their well-being is paramount, and if you've been a foreign language assistant yourself, think back to your time. Think about how you were supported, what was really great, and you probably also have one or two horror stories as well, and think about what you would have liked to happen. So we've all had times when we were really embarrassed, something happened. Think about how you can try to support your foreign language assistant in that. So I'm going to give my story. That's it's probably the second day. I think I was eating the canteen at lunchtime. I was sitting next to the head teacher, and they had massive portions. They had loads and loads of different courses. This was a French lycée, and he asked me if I'd like any more food. I wanted to tell him I was full. Translated that literally in my head. Plein is full. I'm female, therefore pleine. I said je suis pleine, which if you're a French teacher, you know means I am pregnant. Doesn't mean I'm full. Fortunately, the English teacher there, who she was kind of with me for most of the day, and she had also sat at the same table. She was able to jump in quickly and explain the misunderstanding to the head teacher and to the other teachers, who were quite surprised at this table at that point with what this strange English person was saying. So yeah, that's her being there really, really helped. So yeah, think about about your own experience. Before they arrive, communicate with them. If it's possible to do some kind of virtual tour, that would be really useful. But if not, even just give them some local information about, even how do they get to wherever it is they're going to be staying, how do they get to the school, any kind of quirks around that. And then on their first day, make time to introduce them to the staff. I know that you're very busy, but this is really important for them to get off on the right foot. And also not just your department. They will get to know your department really well, but actually for them to have a really good experience and to really get the most out of it, it's good for them to be part of the school. So to meet other people that they might be interested in getting to know. You know, take them to the staff room, introduce them to, you know, the sort of key people in the school that they might need to know, particularly actually the people in the office in reprographics, because they will probably be doing some photocopying things. So, you know, get them on side with the people in reprographics, and, you know, this is the time where you might need to help them out with any vocabulary, because there's going to be a lot of very new vocabulary they wouldn't have, very specific to the school environment. So, you know, get them to make sure you have that meeting with you by your side to, yeah, get any misunderstandings out of the way. Talk them through the school. You know, every school has its quirks, so how does it work? It will be different anyway to their own school system, but also your own school has its own quirks. So that's really useful. For example, I've taught at a school which didn't have any bells. There were no school bells, so the teacher decided, well, there was obviously a time, but the teacher dismissed the class. That wasn't the bell. That's really important, because the foreign language assistant was very used to bells and kind of got really confused and was waiting for the bell, let all the kids out, you know, late from their group. So yeah, make sure you let them know about these things, and also, you know, your scheme of learning, what kind of things you're covering, what levels you kind of expect from different students, what behaviour you expect from students, and what's acceptable and what isn't, because again, that will be different culturally as well as in your school. Establish your boundaries, your routines, how this is going to work, how the language assistant should be with the staff, with the students. One thing is languages. So as Elaine mentioned, you might want to kind of use the assistant as a bit of free CPD for your staff, and to practice speaking French, German, Spanish, or whatever. At the same time, they're there to learn English. You need to do it so it's fair. So try to establish some kind of boundary. Right, at break times we speak French, and at lunchtimes we speak English, or on this day we speak French, or whatever it is, so that everybody kind of gets that fair deal. And also, if it is a case of no, they're speaking English all the time because that's what they're there to learn, then let them know, you know, under what circumstances can they speak French to you, or German, or whatever they need to do. So, you know, we've always made it clear, you know, at this point we're speaking English because that's what you need to do. But if things get really tough, or you've got some bad news or something, you need to just, you know, vent or something, then it's fine. You can go back into your native language and deal with that. So just establish that. And particularly if you have a sixth form or older students, A-level equivalent students or higher students, what you need to establish boundaries, what is appropriate. So it is quite common for sixth form students to socialise with language assistants, but you need to work out what your school policy is on that, whether that's acceptable, and so on. So that's something to have a discussion with leadership in your school, and then to make sure that's very, very clear to the assistants. Think about your timetabling. So target the classes that you want them to work with. It doesn't necessarily have to be all of your exam classes. You know, it's good, they can be useful to have other ones. It doesn't also have to be all the nice classes. You know, it can also be a challenging class as well. They can be really useful, but think about how they will work with the teacher in that class. Try to make it so it's fairly distributed between the year groups, between the teachers, and so on. And if it's possible to do it so they get, you know, an extra day off in the week, that is a really nice thing to do. It might not be possible, it depends on the school timetable, but if there's a way to do that, or to do it that, you know, they get a half day at some point or whatever and they're allowed to leave, I know I certainly appreciated that when I was an assistant as well. With each teacher, plan the introduction to their class and make sure that they do set off on the right foot, because I've had the experience of going into a class with a teacher who wasn't really expecting me, and then they sort of said, oh great, let's ask the English person some questions, and of course nobody had any questions. They weren't prepared. They looked at me like I was an alien. I wanted the ground to swallow me up. It was really embarrassing, and I found it really difficult to gel with that class, where there was with other classes with different teachers where we really prepared how this was going to work. I had maybe a small presentation, or she had already worked on questions that they wanted to ask me beforehand. That little bit of preparation really means a difference. And think about when you're an assistant, or actually as a trainee, you know, your first introduction to classes is really, really important. And then also, you know, when they arrive, consider if it's possible to do a social outing when we're all allowed to go out again. That would be really nice. just again to get them to know everybody and to introduce them to the culture a little bit. When they're during their stay, I would encourage your assistants to keep the kind of folder which has all the resources that they create, because they're amazing in my experience at creating resources, games, flashcards, whatever. Let them have this folder of resources, because that's so useful for the next foreign language assistant that comes. They've already got some resources there. They can see the kind of thing that's been done before. They get some ideas. Remember, most of the time these people have not had any training in how to teach. They haven't had training in resource preparation, so any help that they can get is really great. And also, we used to ask them to write a letter to the next assistant. It would be sealed, and we swore that we would not open it. We promised we would not open it. So said, write what you like, be as honest as you like, we will not read it. You can hide it somewhere if you like. And for the next person, I think that's really useful, and it just felt like yeah, kind of welcoming for them. Try to get, as I've mentioned quite a few times before, be really clear with them about what you'd like from them, what you're trying to achieve. And we had a rule that we had to give them the outline for the next week by Friday. And I actually found that when we had an assistant and I was doing that, that actually really made me be more disciplined, because usually I would say, oh, I'm planning down on a Sunday, but actually, because I knew, look, this is only fair, I need to give the assistant time to prepare stuff, over the weekend or with Friday, so I need to get this planned, at least what I'm doing, even overview of what I'm doing. So let them know exactly, if they're practicing vocabulary, what is it they're practicing. If you can give them, a copy of the textbook if you're using one, or whatever it is, or if you've got a knowledge organizer, let them have that. And yeah, to try to do it by Friday, that's really fair. If you're an experienced teacher, you might be quite good at sort of winging it and making it up, or planning in 5 minutes the day before. An assistant isn't going to be, and they're going to need that more time. During the time, check in regularly with them, just keep an eye out on them, and ask them how they're getting on, and lunch times and things, or break duties, or whatever. Chat to them, make sure they are okay, let them know that they can come to you if they're having problems. And finally, there are various sort of social media accounts that can be really useful. So the British Council Language Assistance podcast, for example, that can give you ideas and give them ideas as well. And also, I know there are often sort of groups for language assistants in the area. So if you're in a city, then there will hopefully be lots of schools, and many of whom will have an assistant. So I found it really, really useful when I was teaching in Rennes. There was a Facebook group which had all the assistants kind of in the Brittany area, sort of in the nearest few towns and cities, and we met up, and we could sort of exchange stories and tips and things, and just provide a bit of a support network for each other. And sometimes just to hear some English was nice, for a bit of a break. So that's that, and I'm going to pass you over to Elaine for the final part on making the case for a language assistant.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. I've got a few minutes left to get this done, so I'll whiz through this. I think it's really important what Zoe's mentioned there, and it's crucial to have a good mentor for your NQT. Sorry, I'm going back to last week's training, for your language assistant, because obviously, they're going to be quite needed. They're a new member of staff, so if you have someone in your department, maybe a junior member of your department, to be able to be a mentor for them is absolutely crucial. And certainly, we know that budgets are stretched. We know that it's really difficult to make the case for a language assistant, but you really need to think about what value would an assistant bring to my school and the department and the classroom, and really I think it's massive really when you think about it. They bring so much to the school in many areas of culture, many areas of just like life experiences, and also the cross-curricular aspect for your school. Aiming for it to be a non-negotiable in your school, because it does deepen the language learning. And as you can see here, I've put a couple of quotes from the Ofsted framework in England, if it's useful for you to have that as a sort of lever for your senior leadership team, where you can see right in the middle, I won't read this, but it talks about the government aspiration. It's not a definite thing that's going to happen. It's a government aspiration to the numbers of students that they're wanting to do languages going forward. And I think as well the 1+2 approach in Scotland, the primary sector, and I know Wales are moving towards that way as well in terms of how they're working. It's a really important thing to be able to show that you're doing something with that, and all head teachers are focused on Ofsted. Well, they will be when we go back, I'm sure, into the normal classroom going forward more now. And obviously it helps with the curriculum narrowing. So again, they're taken from the Ofsted document. So can move on to the next slide, Zoe, please. Thank you. Those of you that are aware that, excuse me, the 2021 consultation came out last week on the 10th of March and is open until the 19th of May for the new GCSE, and the understanding of other cultures is absolutely crucial in that for England. And you can see there in italics the section about the fact that languages should be taught, and that they should become familiar with aspects of context of other countries and communities. That is a real key driver for having an assistant. It does expand a students' horizons, it encourages them to step beyond familiar cultural boundaries, and it definitely develops new ways of seeing the world. And obviously with a greater emphasis on phonics and reading aloud now that's being proposed in this documentation, which again is out for consultation on the Ofqual website, it's important to be able to show that you know what's going on in languages, and that your senior leadership team really ought to be looking very seriously at taking forward this proposal to have an assistant. Okay, so we move on to the next one. Thank you. I've put at the bottom of this the link to the consultation, and again, as Zoe said, this will go out tomorrow live, but if you Google Ofqual MFL, you'll see that there are 2 consultations that are live at the moment. And as a linguist myself, and I know Zoe will echo this, it's so important to get everybody to put their views in for this consultation, because it's going to have a big impact upon the way that languages is shaped for the next sort of generation really of teachers and of students. Making a case for your language assistant, they can be involved in setting up projects with your school, with other schools abroad, with other schools in the area. As Zoe said, if you have an assistant, you know, I live in Leeds, so there we have a regular meeting of the assistants I know in other schools. Setting up a project, an interlink project between schools, is really good. Students get involved, the assistants get involved, and just any project they can do across school, however good that project is got to be valuable for your students. Getting them to be involved in lunchtime clubs or after school clubs. I know in some schools lunchtime clubs don't happen because lunchtime is only 30 minutes, but certainly if you work in the private sector, lunchtimes might be longer, or you might work in a school where there is a lot of stuff happens at lunchtime because students are bussed in after school, so no after school activities take place, so you may well be able to do it then, but they certainly can help with that. It supports the transition, as we've talked about earlier, about getting your students into your foreign language assistant into a primary school. If you've got the opportunity to send them there for 1 hour a week, or even 1 hour every 2 weeks as part of their time, and they are allowed to work up to an extra 6 hours on top of the 12 hours that they are working, and you can pay them that, so they're allowed to work 18 hours. So if they wanted to earn some more money or to have some more experience, that is a good opportunity to do that. And obviously with the Scottish 1+2, if you are in a Scottish primary, then you have a very good opportunity there to push for a foreign language assistant. If you work in a socially deprived area, again, this is crucial for your students to have access to a cultural background, and therefore an FLA will support that. They also, in today's situation where you may have non-specialists delivering, obviously with the Ofsted framework changing slightly last year and putting a greater emphasis on students doing Key Stage 4 that was 2 years rather than 3 years. Now we've got in the situation where a lot more students are learning languages in year 9 if your school's gone down that way, and you may have non-specialists delivering Key Stage 3. So if you have a foreign language assistant with you, or someone who is a specialist teacher, that can add to their sort of team teaching and add to their expertise. Obviously supporting staff with CPD again is really good. And just in the last sort of week, the government have announced that MFL teachers have just been added to the shortage profession list. So having an MFL teacher with you in the classroom, you could say, well, you know, it's really important that we have someone from another country who speak where the language is spoken. And obviously with the national tutoring programme, and I hate to use this word catch up because it's a really negative negative sort of connotation, but any gaps that need to be filled, you might be able to tap into the National Tutoring Programme for some funding to actually get a specialist assistant. Might not be a foreign language assistant, but you might be able to get around it with a specialist assistant of someone who maybe can support you in the classroom. Okay, and then again, the last slide, Zoe. Before I just share a couple of experiences with you. There's been some big changes since what's gone with Brexit. So if you are looking into having an assistant now, you will need to contact the British Council because they've changed the terms and conditions. You can either have an assistant for a short period of time or for a long period of time, and there is the website to go on to that. And I cannot tell you how important it is to look at that and to look at the handbook with regard to supporting assistants wherever you are in the world. The British Council handbook is exceptionally good. Just a few things I want to add, Zoe, before you move on. Some of the experiences that I've had with assistants this year to be mindful of for next year, or if you have, you really need to make sure that when they arrive they have some form of passport with them, because some assistants have arrived across the country, or I've been told with only an ID card. I think that will be more difficult after Brexit now, but the crucial things that you need to support them with are opening a bank account, getting a DBS sorted out, getting a computer email address for their school, and obviously ensuring that if they need one, they have a biometrics the biometrics visa that they need. But the most important thing I found is with a lot of them is making sure that they sign the paperwork to opt out of the teacher's pension, because in the first 2 months that they arrive here, they probably will have some savings, but by the second month they tend to sort of start to dwindle. So if they have to pay into the teacher's pension scheme and you've not signed the paperwork to do that, that's quite a lot of money that will be taken out of their first and second salaries, and it takes a little bit of time to get back. So that's just giving you a heads up on that. Okay, Zoe, I think I'm done now with my session. Thank you. I'll hand back to you for any questions or anything else. You're on mute, Zoe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, classic.
Not to worry.
So thanks very much. Yeah, that's really useful, especially that last tip there about the teacher's pension, because that's one that I think a lot of people get slipped up on. And I just want to make one final point about making the case for a language assistant of whatever kind to your SLT, because I know that this is something which lots of senior leadership teams can be a bit reticent about, and in a way that also feels a little bit weird as a teacher saying that you need somebody who is more of an expert than you to assist you. That can feel a bit strange. But if you make a comparison with, for example, science teachers have lab technicians. That's an accepted thing. That is something which most schools would see as absolutely valuable and does not have any bearing on the expertise of the teacher. That they're a really important assistant. And also in many English departments, for example, it's quite common to put aside some of the budget to have visits from authors, from poets or whatever, from any experts coming in. And that is seen as something which is absolutely very vital, and it's really useful for the students and to give them a different perspective and to give them more motivation. I would say that a language assistant could actually be cheaper than a visit from a very well-known author, and is much more long-term and is really, really useful as well, and actually plays a similar role, but actually with potentially even bigger impact, because it's not just one afternoon, it is several months. And so think about these comparisons as well when you're making your case. Right, we're going to have to finish there, but just before we go, remind you of the webinars that we've got coming up. So next week, looking at practical tips for non-specialist teaching MFL. So please do spread the word if you know any primary colleagues or colleagues in secondary who are timetable with the language, but it's not necessarily the one they trained to teach, even if they might speak it. And we would love to hear your feedback, so please, you can write it in the chat so we can get it directly now. You can email us. Our email addresses are at the top. Dan at languagenut.com is the person who looks after sort of teachers doing demos and things. If you'd like a free trial or you'd like a demo, if you are a LanguageNut subscriber or you would like to be one or potentially try it out, no pressure at all for that. And yeah, please do get in touch if you've got any questions, anything that we can help you with. And we'd love it if you have found this session useful. Please do let people know on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. That really helps us just to spread the word. We're trying to keep providing these CPD sessions for teachers. I think it's sort of doing our duty really. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the session, and you will see the recording of this probably on the website tomorrow.
Thank you.